initially, Russia was projecting its strength and continued to achieve offensive successes. That's something that we've seen fall apart quite dramatically over time.
I am delighted to talk today to military analyst Sim Tack about the latest on the war in Ukraine. So first of all, Sim, reports are claiming that Ukraine is aiming to retake Crimea by Christmas. So if that's true, what land defences are Russians putting in place to defend their land?
Well, we've actually seen Russia for quite some time now put in place a lot of really extensive defensive preparations. So before announcing that they were actually withdrawing from the areas of Kherson north of the Dnieper River, they had already been establishing all of these trench systems primarily in a lot of key locations south of the river, as well as in other areas of Ukraine. We've seen that initially all the way in the east near Kharkiv, where several months ago Ukraine managed to regain a lot of terrain from Russia. And now we're, of course, seeing that around Kherson as the Russians are adjusting their positions there.
Would you mind going into detail about the types of defences? So are there different layers of defence that we'll see from Russia?
In most places, these defenses consist of multiple layers. The one component that's pretty much always present are infantry trenches. So the typical trenches that we've seen in much older conflicts like World War I, of course, which is famous for the trench warfare. But we're also seeing several other types of barriers being layered on top of that in a lot of different places. So one kind of composition that we see in a lot of different locations is on the outside, Russian forces will erect an earthen berm, which of course impedes vehicular movement, but also provide concealment and cover to forces that are located behind it. And then we'll see a second layer consisting of these concrete dragon's teeth, as they are called, which are essentially also barriers to the movement of armored vehicles. And then in a third layer is where we'll get back to those infantry trenches where the actual forces are located in a position where they can also project fire onto those previous barriers, the berms and the dragon's teeth. So the idea is to slow down those forces as they are approaching the Russian units.
And this weekend, there are also reports of Russia launching about 300 strikes against Ukraine. And yet, in the media, it seems that we're seeing everything about Russia running low on morale and running low on troops and stocks. What's powering them? How can this keep going?
One thing that we have to keep in mind is that even though capacity continues to dwindle on the Russian side, so we do know that they are short of precision-guided munitions and things like that. That doesn't mean they have none and that they don't have any other tools to continue their attacks, right? So Russia's been very actively trying to use different types of weapons, older types of weapons, to replace some of those higher-end weapons that they are running short of. And I think one of the other aspects that is playing a part at this point is that expectation of Iranian-made weapons to be delivered to Russia at some point in the future, or possibly already ongoing, that might actually cause Russia to be willing to expend some of those reserves that it still has a little faster, on the anticipation that they might soon have other systems to replace them with.
And how do you see this war ending?
So that's a very difficult question, obviously, right? It's difficult to really say how exactly it will end. I think one of the things that we've seen develop over the past months, or actually since the beginning of the war, really, we've seen the directionality of the conflict change, where initially Russia was projecting its strength and continued to achieve offensive successes. That's something that we've seen fall apart quite dramatically over time, right? So as time has progressed, Ukraine has become more and more capable to actually regain ground from Russia. And even in those places where the Russians are still the most capable on the ground right now, which I would say right now is kind of what we're seeing along the front line around Donetsk, south of Donetsk. That's where Russia is putting the strongest effort to resume offensive operations. Even in those places, it appears that Ukrainian forces are able to at the very least hold their ground against those Russian advances. So I think if we extrapolate that into the future, we get to a point where we could see Ukraine continue to wear down that Russian capacity and continue to regain territory. Now, one big problem there in terms of saying how will this all end, and having some kind of certainty to saying, well, Ukraine is going to win this war if things continue the way they are, is that a lot of things can change. And one of the big ones there, I think, is the Western support for Ukraine, where already now in the past few months, we see that Ukraine is facing difficulties because they are getting lower amounts of supplies when it comes to, for example, the Javelin missiles, the analyst, those kind of anti-tank weapons are running out essentially as Ukraine is expending them on the battlefield. Kind of in the same vein, there are shortages in artillery munitions, with a lot of Western countries, NATO members saying, we have to maintain our own stockpiles. We can't simply hand everything over to Ukraine, of course. And then there's also been some of the questions about the longer range systems, such as the HIMARS and its longer range brother, the ATACMS, which would enable Ukraine to put even more pressure on Russian logistics, Russian gatherings farther away from the front line. And depending on how the West is actually going to structure its support to Ukraine and what types of weapons it will be able to deliver or continue delivering, that could make a really big difference in Ukraine's ability to continue making headway through the next year, I'd say.
Sim, fast forward 5 years from now into the future. Is Putin still in power?
So 5 year times is 5 years time is a really interesting question there. Because first of all, one thing to consider is that when we go back before the start of this war, Putin was already in somewhat of the beginning of the end of his reign, right? Now that the fixed date on that, the end of Putin's eligible terms is only 2036. That's still some time away. But just for context, the period that Russia was entering was already very difficult, even without this conflict. Demographics, economic development, the expectation of a political system that might not be able to lean on Putin as a personality to manage it. All of those things were coming closer and closer and were causing some anxiety in Russian politics, so to say. I think all of that is now coming much faster because of the conflict, because of the damage that has done to the Russian economy, the damage that the military failure has done to the political establishment. I think for sure all of that is coming closer to us, but I don't know whether within the next 5 years we should expect some kind of a dramatic change, like a coup or something within Moscow that would be able to unseat Putin.
And then finally, I just want to ask, how serious, or how big is the risk of this conflict spilling over into neighbouring states?
So we've seen the incident with the missile that fell inside Poland, of course, and that is something that people, I think, rightfully would consider spilling over into another territory already. But I think realistically, the odds are low that Russia would willingly expand that war to the territory of other NATO countries because of the obvious military repercussions that something like that would lead to. Now, when we are talking about other ways of the conflict spilling over into NATO countries, I think to a degree that is already happening, where the information war, the economical warfare, all of these things, of course, have already involved most, if not all, of NATO as part of the broader conflict. But I think both NATO and Russia actually have some very, very fair interests in keeping the actual fighting part of the conflict contained to Ukrainian territory.